Good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. My name is Nima Hussain, and I will be chairing this very important meeting of the Zero COVID Coalition. Tonight, the theme of our meeting is Can the NHS cope under the weight of government policy? We called this meeting with this title even before anyone had heard of the Omicron strain of the coronavirus. This will bring a whole set of additional challenges for the NHS. But it is undeniable that the NHS was already under enormous strain even before that happened. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to examine what those threats are, how we got here, and what we should be arguing for and lobbying and campaigning for to alleviate the crisis. Some of you may have seen that advocates for greater measures to suppress the virus have come under attack in the press, and this campaign has also come under attack as well. The attacks are scurrilous, especially against Professor Susan Michi, who is a respected academic and member of Independent Sage. So I want to express my full support on behalf of the coalition for her and the great work that she does. We have had attacks now from the Financial Times, the Daily Mail, and the Times, amongst others. There is always a pattern. When the government is in trouble over its policy failures in the pandemic, or when there is a new threat requiring new measures, these attacks resume. Well, they won't silence us or the other advocates for a more sensible, more humane and rational policy. As we said in our previous meeting, COVID isn't going away, so neither are we. On a bit of self-publicity, please feel free to check out our Twitter feed, our YouTube channel, and our website. There is a wealth of material there from our previous meetings and other sources as well. We have a great lineup of speakers tonight. I'm pleased to say our range of speakers is broadening with each meeting, which means we are gaining ground. First up is a speaker who barely needs introduction, our co-convener of the campaign, Diane Abbott MP. Unfortunately, Diane is unable to join us live this evening, but has sent us this video. Sorry, just a little technical difficulty there.
Thank you all for coming to this meeting this evening. I know from my mail and emails that very many members of the public are worried about the spread of coronavirus and deeply anxious about the precarious state of our NHS. And these two things are linked. I know that these two issues can feel overwhelming. We want the crisis in the NHS to end, we want to fight off privatisation, and we also want the government's disastrous policy response to the pandemic to be reversed. At a minimum, they should already have implemented a plan B. But there should be no sense of powerlessness or feeling that nothing can be done. It's certainly the case that some harsh consequences have already been imposed on us all, and that the forces raged against us are very powerful. I'll speak about those later. Even so, I want to remind you all that the majority of the public are opposed to where the government is going, and that this government can be forced into U-turns. That should be our starting point. We're in a difficult situation, we've had some serious setbacks, but we can still push back and win against Boris and his policies. Looking at popular opinion, according to the regular YouGov surveys, support for the government handling of the pandemic fell below 50% in mid-July and has stayed there ever since. This week, the Tories voted to end the NHS as we know it, with one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation in my lifetime. More recently, government ministers have told us that we're on the last leg of the coronavirus, the worst is behind us, and even that, I quote, it was all over bar the shouting, unquote. None of that was true, and the overwhelming majority of the public know this. The government promised us that there would be no more restrictions, That was a false promise. They are being forced to U-turn on restriction, and MPs recently voted for more of them in government legislation. And there's been another U-turn, again too little too late. There's finally a pre-travel requirement for testing, which the government had said it wouldn't implement to help the airline and travel industries, but they've U-turned on that. I'm pleased to say that Labour colleagues on the front bench, as well as SAGE and other bodies, have called for this measure for some time. So you see, the government can be forced into reverse by pressure. And this must be seen in the overall political situation. This is a government and a Prime Minister whose popularity has plummeted, especially in the last few weeks. Living standards are falling, official forecasts are that they will fall even further. In addition, there is the growing scandal of sleaze and corruption. The latest is a scandal of the Christmas party in Downing Street this time last year, when it was illegal. More importantly, it was a time when loved ones could not even visit their sick or dying relatives in hospital, because that was part of the same regulation. The clear message to the population is you have to follow the rules, but Boris and his friends do not. Naturally, bereaved relatives and others are furious about the government's double standards. So this is a weaker government than it's often perceived, and it can be forced to change position. But I just don't want to mislead anyone into believing it is easy. We have recently suffered a severe defeat with the passage of the Health and Care Bill. This paves the way for the accelerated privatisation of the NHS, its breaking up and its lack of accountability to everybody except the private sector who want to feed off it. No doubt others will elaborate on this evening. It's already the case that the NHS is objectively in crisis, a crisis it has never faced before. It is projected that NHS waiting lists will soar to over 10 million people next year. That's up from 2.5 million back in 2010. And we know the ambulance service is also in crisis. This isn't surprising because the NHS is chronically underfunded and understaffed. We know this cabinet faces privatisation and has already terribly abused public funding during the pandemic, handing out big contracts to its friends. And the government's policy of relying solely on vaccines, which have never eliminated the pandemic anywhere, just makes it easier for them to take over the NHS. GPs have had to cut services, as have non-emergency departments, even though they often deal with serious and life-threatening conditions such as cancer. None of this is their fault. The government is almost turning the NHS into a COVID-only services, with huge resources diverted to jabbing or testing or treated COVID patients. And the central aim of government policy has not changed. Even when it's forced to backtrack temporarily, its policy has always been to prioritise the interests of the private sector above a public health. But all is not lost. An increasingly unpopular government can be forced to U-turn if we are strong enough to force them. This means not facilitating privatisation. It means supporting pay rises for NHS workers. It means getting your campaign bodies, your communities, your political parties and unions to commit to reversing privatisation. It also means arguing for the only strategy that can only work: zero COVID. We cannot give up this fight.
Thank you, Diane. Now it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Louise Irvin, who is a leading advocate and campaigner in Keep Our NHS Public. Louise will concentrate on the process and methods of privatisation of the NHS, which has been one of the key factors in weakening it and undermining its ability to cope with the current crisis and the campaign against it. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm speaking on behalf of Keep Our NHS Public and Health Campaigns Together. and I'm also chair of the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. I've been asked to talk about NHS privatisation and the Health and Care Bill, but first I'd like to mention the People's COVID Inquiry, which presented its final report last week. The People's COVID Inquiry was called early this year by Keep Our NHS Public in the absence of the government public inquiry that should have happened in a timely way to learn lessons and save lives. It was chaired by Michael Mansfield QC, and you can listen to the testimony and read the report on peoplescovidinquiry.com. The main finding of the inquiry was that the government was guilty of misconduct in public office, culpable of causing tens of thousands of avoidable deaths by failing to plan appropriately for a pandemic and to act promptly and effectively once it was upon us. Furthermore, the government's neglect of the NHS, as well as the impact of a decade of austerity on health inequalities and the fragmentation of the NHS and social care through privatisation and outsourcing, contributed to the catastrophe. The People's COVID Inquiry had a session on privatisation during the pandemic, and that is well worth watching and reading. The history of NHS privatisation, I could talk for hours on it, but I'll just summarise it very quickly. NHS privatisation began under Margaret Thatcher, who outsourced non-clinical support services. It continued under John Major, who introduced PFI, the Private Finance Initiative. It accelerated under New Labour, who massively embraced PFI at a cost of over 80 billion for contracts worth 11 billion, and who privatised clinical services for the first time. It then accelerated further under the coalition government, who brought in the Health and Social Care Act in 2012, which created clinical commissioning groups, CCGs, and obliged them to put contracts out to tender. And during the past 6 years of Tory government, privatisation has continued apace in all sectors of the health service, including hospital, community and mental health services, general practice, patient support services, laboratories, pharmacies, and diagnostics. The government used the cover of the COVID pandemic to push privatisation even further, giving billions of pounds worth of contracts to private firms, including private hospitals, to deal with NHS waiting lists. Now, for the first time ever, more than half of hip and knee replacements in England are being performed in private rather than NHS hospitals, with almost half being paid for privately, as people respond to the growing waiting lists by going private if they can. Thus, the downgrading of the NHS allows the private sector to grow, poaching NHS staff and cherry-picking the easy contracts. In July, the government introduced a new bill, the Health and Care Bill, that threatens to embed privatisation even more deeply in our health service. The Health and Care Bill does nothing to address the pressing problems facing the NHS that Diana outlined, problems of underfunding, understaffing and fragmentation. It proposes nothing to remedy the deep failings in social care or the health inequalities besetting our society. The bill passed its third reading recently and is currently in the Lords, where amendments are being considered before returning to the Commons in the new year for its final reading. There are several key issues that we Keep Our NHS Public and others oppose in the bill. And I could go on for ages about it, but I'll try to summarise. These include breaking the English NHS into 42 integrated care systems that undermine the NHS as a unified national public service and facilitate the kinds of rationing and denial of care we see in the managed care organisations in the USA. It does not prevent private companies being invited to sit on the integrated care service boards, integrated care system boards, leading to potential conflicts of interests where providers can organise to ensure they get the contracts. It will remove the competition rules that went some way to ensuring fair competition and preventing cronyism. Now, though we're against markets and competition in the NHS, we believe that an unregulated market is worse than a regulated one, as we saw during COVID when contracts were handed out to Tory friends without any competitive tendering or scrutiny. The unions are concerned that breaking up the NHS into 42 distinct organisations could undermine national collective bargaining and NHS terms and conditions. And finally, there's a massive reduction in public and local authority accountability and powers of scrutiny. Keep Our NHS Public is working with others, such as We Own It, Health Campaigns Together, trade unions, including the GMB, Just Treatment, and 999 Call for the NHS, to campaign against the Health and Care Bill. We've focused on raising awareness and lobbying MPs and Lords. We recently handed in a petition of nearly 250,000 signatures against the bill. And our campaigning continues, and you can find out more about that on the Keep Our NHS Public website. Keep Our NHS Public is also working with Independent Sage to develop a charter to campaign to rebuild and repair the NHS, public health, and our unequal society. Keep Our NHS Public, Health Campaigns Together, and trade unions, including the GMB, are planning a campaign to address the winter crisis across the NHS. I'm mentioning these things to just show the breadth of campaigning that is going on. We're supporting the judicial review into the decision to give 37 GP contracts in London to Oprah's Health, a subsidiary of the US giant corporation Centene. And we easily raised £70,000 in our crowdfunder, which shows how much popular support there is. This JR will be heard in January or February. We're also supporting the campaign for a decent pay rise for NHS and social care workers. We're supporting the health and care workers in struggle, including outsourced workers like the security guards at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And we're also campaigning for migrant health rights against the hostile environment in healthcare, as well as working with disabled and older people's organisations to reform social care. There is so much that people can get involved in that's so important, and Diana is absolutely right. Campaigning can be effective. If you don't fight, you can never win. And if you do fight, you sometimes win, as we saw with the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. If there's enough public opposition, the government can be forced to make U-turns. And even if we don't win outright, we can at least raise awareness and work towards a future alternative government with progressive NHS policies. So there is all to play for, and I'd really urge everybody. I'm going to post links to the websites I mentioned on the chat, and I urge everybody to get involved in any way they can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you for the links that are in the chat there. I think they're there for everyone as well, so everybody's got access to them. Next, I'm delighted to welcome back Senior Lecturer at Queen Mary University in London, Deepti Gurdasani, who has spoken so clearly and brilliantly at a number of our previous meetings. We're going to ask Deepti to cover quite a lot, but she's excellent at this. She will speak about the general overall global situation in light of the emergence of Omicron, as well as the current situation here. And I hope she will be able to address what the government ought to be doing in the current situation. Dr. Gurdasani?
Thank you. I'm just going to share a few slides. So I mainly want to talk about the Omicron threat and what it means in terms of the changing pandemic across the globe, but also in terms of the UK. I'm deeply, deeply concerned by the threat posed by Omicron, and I'm going to explain why. So just to recap first, this is a new variant. It's very, very different from any previous variant we've seen of this virus. And it's a variant that's rapidly grown from about 0% to becoming dominant in Gauteng province in South Africa in a period of 2 weeks. So this is the fastest growth we've seen so far of any particular variant. And it sort of grew against a background of Delta, but very low cases in Gauteng before this. And if you look at this black line, you can see why I'm saying rapid growth, because the steepness of growth is actually much greater than previous waves. So we're seeing doubling of case numbers every 3 days or so. And even now the positivity rate in South Africa is it's about 25%, which means that even the cases that are being seen now are being underdetected. So why is this happening? I think this is a key question many of us are trying to answer. So this is a variant that's clearly more fit than Delta, because Delta was not spreading. So the R was below 1 for Delta when this variant took off in Gauteng province. So it could be that it's more able to escape background immunity in the population, or it's more transmissible than Delta, or it's a combination of both. And given Delta is a very fit variant in itself, so it's quite transmissible and also more able to escape vaccines than previous variants, this is really concerning. Any variant fitter than Delta is concerning. So there is already strong evidence from research done in South Africa that shows that previous immunity with other variants does not protect as well against Omicron. So what they're seeing in South Africa is a much greater level of reinfection than they've seen with previous variants, suggesting that immunity from natural infection from another variant doesn't protect you as well against Omicron. So although vaccination levels are quite low in South Africa for many reasons, including supply, but also vaccine hesitancy, there has been very high background exposure to the virus. So if you look at serological studies, between 60 to 80% of people will have antibodies. And that combined with vaccination means that this is a population with high background immunity, and any virus spreading rapidly in a population with high background immunity is very, very worrying. The SAGE minutes that were released, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, say with high confidence that this is a variant that will show some evasion from vaccines. The level of evasion we don't quite know yet, but it will show evasion from previous immunity, but also from vaccines to some extent. And in this light, we think boosters are vitally important because they massively increase your immune response. So one would hope that even if there was escape from a new variant, it would to some extent be overridden just by the sheer quantity of the immune response, which is what boosters help with. So does it spread more easily? Is it more transmissible? We don't know the answer to that, but early signs are concerning because certainly it's fitter in that it is spreading faster, but is it because it's more able to escape background immunity, or because, it spreads more easily, it's more transmissible? Those are the key questions, and very likely it's a combination of both. But there have been huge super spreading events that have been recently documented, including the one in Norway that I'm sure everyone here has heard about, where 100 out of 120 people attending an event got infected, and they were all vaccinated, including transmission between people who've been boosted in Israel. So this is a variant that's super spreading in environments where people are vaccinated. And that's really concerning. So what about impact? It's not just that cases are rising. Unfortunately, I hear a lot of rhetoric about this variant being potentially mild, but that's not really been borne out by the data. And there seems to be a sort of push, I feel, in the media to portray this as being mild so that perhaps action doesn't need to be taken. When there's uncertainty in any case, you should act early, but hospitalizations are rising, and they're rising rapidly in Gauteng. They're more than doubling every week, and there are lags in reporting anyway. And we know that the impact on hospitalizations is generally felt a bit later in time. So even the early signs are concerning. And this is really, really worrying. When we look at the distribution of hospitalizations by age, 11% of the admissions are in children less than 2 years. So that's that big spike that you can see on the left-hand corner. This is the age on this axis. And you can see infections are primarily in young people, but hospitalizations are primarily in young people rather than older people, but very high levels of hospitalization in young children. Of course, South Africa, in terms of the population pyramid, is very different from ours because, it's sort of bottom heavy with many more young people. But even considering that, this is a very high number of hospitalizations. And, when you look at the differences between this particular wave in terms of hospitalizations and previous waves, so these are different age groups. And I'm sorry, this is hard to see, but this is from the report from South Africa that came out today on hospitalizations. And these are the younger age groups. These are the older age groups. Blue shows the last wave, so the Delta wave in South Africa, and orange shows the current wave. And what we see is a lot more young people being affected. Now, whether this is because young people initially get infected when new variants spread, and we've seen this even in the UK, and then spread to other age groups. So it could just be a matter of time, or it could be a pattern that we're seeing with this variant, or it could be a protection from vaccination, which may have higher uptake in older age groups. So we don't know why we're seeing these differences, but this is particularly concerning. Under 5-year-olds, we're seeing much higher hospitalizations than we've seen in previous waves in South Africa. And when we look at the severity of disease, so if you look at the severity index of admissions, how severe they are, and the proportion of admissions that are severe, again, this is by age group. While you find that in older age groups, perhaps people with less severe disease are being hospitalized at the moment, in younger age groups, those being hospitalized actually have a higher severity of disease. And that's the orange lines. So you can see that the proportion with severe disease actually double in the current wave for young people. For older people, it is lower. And, a lot of this has been interpreted by people as, okay, it's causing milder disease. I just want to explain why these current trends are worrying. So yes, the number of people in hospital requiring oxygen currently is lower than in the previous wave in South Africa. But so for the same stage of the wave, the Omicron, in the current wave, fewer people are requiring oxygen. But you can see that the rate of rise, which is the thing that really matters in the pandemic, is what's concerning here. And the rate of rise in requirement of oxygen is very, very quickly going to outstrip Delta because of the rate of exponential spread. So ultimately, it's the growth rate that matters rather than the individual severity. I mean, severity does matter as well, but any fast-moving pandemic can easily outstrip any advantage you gain from disease being milder, which there is no indication it is. So to really drill that point in, ultimately viruses act in different ways. So they have a growth rate, which is exponential, and they have severity. So how likely, if you get infected, are you going to die? And people often talk about severity alone, but actually transmissibility matters more because ultimately it's an exponential. So if many, many more people get infected, even if your death rate is halved, it's ultimately going to kill more people simply because transmissibility acts on an exponential scale, whereas severity acts on a linear scale. So this is a strain that's 50% more transmissible, and this is 50% more lethal. And you can see the one that's 50% more lethal makes a relatively small difference compared to the one that's more transmissible. So a very fit variant that's rapidly spreading, as this variant is now, irrespective of the severity, will cause massive burden on healthcare services and potentially a very large number of deaths. So we know that there are lags between cases and deaths, so we don't know the impact on deaths yet. But very early signs in Tshwane, which is the epicenter of the pandemic in Gauteng province, very early signs that deaths are rising. And this is sort of a breakdown of 23 deaths in Tshwane, which was published today. And once again, what we see is, we don't see a pattern where the deaths are mainly happening in older age groups. We're seeing a pattern where they're happening across all age groups, including very young children. And that's worrying, although, these are small numbers. And what's happening in the UK, this is just, I think, very recently out. I mean, predictably, we have a lot of community transmission in the UK. I mean, there's no doubt, given the sort of border policy that we've had in the past and the high levels of transmission and the lack of mitigations, that not only would a variant like this be able to enter quite easily, it would quite easily spread. And that's what we're seeing. And this to me is the most worrying of all, because a lot of people feel that perhaps the UK will be protected more because a higher proportion of the population is vaccinated. So perhaps this variant will have a disadvantage here. It's possible, but early findings don't look good. Although the numbers of this variant in the UK are low, so probably a few hundred people, the rate of growth is very fast. And there is uncertainty around this because of small numbers, but what we're seeing are fourfold increases every week. And with fourfold increases every week, it doesn't take a long time for a variant to become dominant, even though it's at low frequency, because it's a massive exponential growth. So we should expect this variant, I think, to take over a period of time, irrespective of the level of vaccination that we have in our population. Perhaps boosters will help, but that remains to be seen. What really worries me is that we were already in a crisis with Delta. So this is on top of that. Cases have been rising, and that's Delta cases. They're already very high, and they're continuing to rise, particularly in those younger age groups. Our hospitals are at capacity. We're hearing, we have black alerts on ambulances all over England. Emergency services are struggling to provide care in a timely manner. And, we're continuing to have more than 800 deaths per week. I mean, we've had more than, 15,000 deaths so far over the summer since Freedom Day. And that's higher than almost any other country in Western Europe because of the high levels of infection that we've decided to tolerate. By we, I mean the government, obviously. Many of us think it's unacceptable. And we're having more than 800 admissions per day. So we have a healthcare force that's been devastated by 2 years of not containing the pandemic. And what are we going to do when we have an Omicron wave on top of our Delta wave? And that too over winter at the point that the NHS is normally very strained. And of course, long COVID rates have massively increased. I mean, long COVID in children has doubled in the last 4 months. We have 77,000 children now estimated living with long COVID because of the high levels of infection they've been exposed to in schools. And the government is receiving advice. So SAGE is very worried. They put out a document, a consensus statement very recently, which says preemptive action is needed because of the high level of threat. And the earlier and more stringent the measures, the more geographically broad, the better, because we cannot estimate the impact of the threat, and it could be quite severe. In fact, they've made very, very clear that they support ventilation, face coverings, work from home, and better support with isolation testing, but none of that has made it into government policy, which is essentially still very, very reliant on booster vaccinations and, basic mask mandates in shops and transport, which pretty much almost every country has. And most of Western Europe has gone well beyond that. So I'm going to end on that slightly not very positive note, because I'm really, really concerned about this threat and where we're going with it. And it seems to be very much that we are sleepwalking into, I'm so sorry, into what I think is going to be potentially a disaster given where we are starting from. And what really worries me is the complacency of government where, I mean, they put in place travel bans against South Africa, which made, which one would think, well, first of all, that itself is not evidence-based because by that time it had spread everywhere. But if you're slowing down spread of the variant, surely you're going to do something with that time. You're going to prepare. South Africa is preparing. They're actually increasing pediatrics ICU capacity because they're really worried about this variant. But what are we doing to prepare for this variant? To me, it doesn't look like we're doing anything. And I don't see the point of trying to slow import if then we're not trying to slow transmission within the country. And this variant is going to rapidly gain dominance. And we don't even know what the full impact is going to be because we don't even understand enough about it right now. And I think rather than taking preemptive action, I mean, I would much rather we are overreacting at this point, although I don't see honestly how we could overreact to a threat like this. But to not do anything, to me, is completely reckless, and I can't understand how we are headed that way. And yeah, that's all from me. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Deepti. Thank you so much for that very detailed presentation. And it is incredibly scary that we're just doing nothing in the face of this. Our next speaker is a stalwart of this campaign, Belle Ribeiro Addy MP. Belle will speak to us about what we can all do to prevent an outright destruction of the NHS as we know it. Belle?
Thank you very much, Nima, and thank you for inviting me to speak, and to everybody that's come along this evening. We know that just very recently in the UK, the government of power, the Conservative Party, voted to end our National Health Service as we know it. Now, the NHS is once more in complete crisis under them, and at the same time, the virus is spreading rapidly again. So it's regrettable, but this meeting couldn't be more timely given the situation we find ourselves in. Now, there are three ways in which the government are completely undermining our National Health Service. The first is by allowing the virus to spread unchecked, our Freedom Day, as it was dubbed on the July 19th, was really from the virus and has terrible consequences for the National Health Service. The second way is that the chronic lack of staff and general underfunding of the NHS. According to the OECD, there are 16 countries that spend more per head on health than we do in this country, and 12 countries that spend a greater proportion of their GDP on health. And this is coming from us, the sixth largest economy in the world. And the third is that their plans for breaking up and privatising the NHS are going to cause further catastrophe for the service. Now, according to the OECD, there are 16 countries that are spending more, as I said, and that I think just shows where our priority is. Privatising our health service is only going to create a situation where health is dependent on how much profit people are going to make, and we'll see standards fall. And it's no surprise that whilst these countries are spending a lot more of a proportion of their GDP, that they're having much better health outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, the chronic lack of staff and health and the social care system in complete crisis. And despite this, the Tories actually increasing taxes whilst claiming they've sorted it all out. Now, the OECD also reports there are 30 countries with more doctors per head than we have, and 21 countries with more nurses. And we are almost along in the advanced industrialized countries in not having increased the number of nurses since the year 2000. Also, according to the King's Fund, there's a shortage of at least 76,000 workers of all types in the NHS this year, and this must have an impact on outcomes for both patients and staff alike. Now, one of the reasons why we don't pay our nurses enough one of the reasons why we don't pay our nurses enough is because these government's priorities are all wrong. If we're not paying enough to retain or recruit them, of course, we're going to have a very, very woeful shortage. And as they're under more stress, people begin to leave. Now, on average, in the OECD, trained nurses actually receive 20% more than the median salary in their respective economies. Here, our nurses only earn the average wage. So in effect, nurses in this country are underpaid by 20% relative to international standards, despite all that is asked of them. Now, most of you would have no doubt heard a lot of criticism of the latest health and care bill already this evening. And I can add that the bill is not even designed to address the multiple health and care crises that have been identified. It's a bill that is literally to facilitate the sell-off of bits of the NHS. The bill dismantles the national structures of the NHS, specifically to allow private companies to cherry pick the services they want for profits. And inevitably, this will mean worse service, high charges, and or health insurance costs for many, and even bankruptcy for some. Now, we have already reached a point where there are now 6 million people on our waiting list, and these are forecast to rise to 10 million as soon as next year. We've also seen ambulances queuing around the block because there are no beds, including for seriously ill patients, or ambulances not being sent out because wards are already full. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine says that over 90% of clinical directors have reported that there have been delays admitting patients from ambulances on some days, and over 60% reported that this was happening every single day. Now, of course, the effects of the pandemic have been a huge factor in the latest cycle of the crisis, but that's exactly the point. Under this government, a chronic condition, which has become acute as waiting lists, have continuously lengthened under more than a decade of Conservative Party rule, not just during the pandemic. And the severity of the pandemic is itself a product of the government's vaccine-only policy, where they refuse to adopt other necessary measures unless they're forced into it. They reject mitigating measures which might have prevented the spread of infection in schools. And this has led to serious cases of long COVID and serious illnesses or worse for children and greater community transmission. It is the government's policy to let the virus spread, and it has been a complete disaster and led to a resurgence of the virus, not just here, but elsewhere. Now, the elderly, disabled people, Black and Asian communities have been hit hardest by this policy, and they'll continue to be hit hardest unless we can force them to change course, you know, we always say here, Zero COVID Coalition, there's always an opportunity to change course. And that's why we have to continue with this fight, continue to defend our National Health Service, and continue to demand a suppression policy for the virus, a zero COVID policy. That's the only thing that's going to stop even more preventable deaths. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Belle, and thank you for focusing in there as well on the kind of staffing issues with the NHS. We all understand that the NHS is nothing without its staff. That isn't just the professors and the consultants, but it's all the medical staff, all the porters, cleaners, drivers, and clerical support. Yet there is a chronic shortage of staff in the NHS, which is a key weakness. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Helen O'Connor to speak once more. Helen is an official of the GMB union and activist on protecting the NHS and supporting the fight for better pay and conditions. Helen will speak to us about the current situation for staff on morale and the fight for decent pay and conditions. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to speak, and thank you to all the other fantastic speakers we've heard so far. And yes, the NHS is struggling, and the Tories love nothing more than to point out its shortcomings so that they can reinforce their arguments that further cuts and privatisation are necessary. And cuts and privatisation are at the root of the problems patients have accessing healthcare. While it's fair to say that the pandemic has increased the strain on services, it's important to clarify the point that the slow dismantling of the NHS has been going on for decades. As Louise already said in her speech, it started with Thatcher, the Griffiths report of 1983, which recommended the appointment of general managers. This is where the destruction of the health service was being planned out. The commissioner-provider split, private finance initiatives, and outsourcing were all implemented to move the NHS closer to the open market, to undermine the concept of comprehensive and universal healthcare free at the point of need. Those at the top who want to asset strip the health service claim that the Tories are pouring too much money into a bureaucratic system that's wasteful. The truth is that funding is not keeping pace with inflation, and the limited funding that is going into healthcare is not being targeted correctly because the complex financial instruments utilised for budgeting ensure that trusts are financially penalised if they don't make cutbacks and funnel cash over to the private sector. During the pandemic, it was incorrect to say that the public have to sacrifice their rights and freedoms to protect the NHS rather than to protect each other from infection and serious illness from COVID-19. The Protect the NHS line was designed to frustrate the public and set us all against the service and its staff. The NHS is not a national religion. It's not an archaic institution that's had its day, and no one should ever see the NHS as a sacred cow. The NHS simply should be there for absolutely everyone who lives in this country if and when they need it. There should never be charges for treatment. There never was before. So why do we now have entire teams of people whose sole job it is to work out charges for overseas patients? It was never the case that people were left at home in agony, waiting months for treatment and then forced to go into the private sector. That's another relatively recent development that's coming in by stealth to push healthcare towards an insurance-based model. And the gateways to the NHS are being slowly shut down. This is clear. Emergency departments are being swapped out for urgent care centres, and ambulance crews are queuing, and patients are dying in ambulances. And it's no accident that violence against NHS staff is on the rise. A casualty nurse was stabbed in Lewisham Hospital the other week. This is because people are being denied treatment and being subjected to intolerable waits, and they're wrongly taking out their anger and frustration on the staff. NHS staff are not to blame for this crisis, the government is. And the crisis in the NHS has been deliberately caused, as I've already said, by marketisation of the entire health and care system, and it's now set to accelerate with this health and social care bill, which should be called the privatisation bill, because it will enshrine further cutbacks, further deregulation and further privatisation and make it the law. And we need to be clear that privatisation has been a disaster. It has led to the exploitation of the lowest banded staff, most of who are migrants, Privatisation has led to a reduction in standards, particularly of cleaning and of the provision of nutrition, and this has increased risk to patients. Even prior to COVID-19, patients were vulnerable to infection because outsourced staff were forced to come into hospitals when they were sick themselves because they're denied occupational sick pay by private companies trying to make cutbacks. And I've met outsourced workers facing cancer battles who can't even get sick pay. That's how badly these companies treat their staff. And its privatisation has led to worse services. Instead of taking capacity shortages seriously during the pandemic, the government poured millions into the private sector for the Nightingale hospitals and then found they didn't have the staff to run them. And the truth is, through the course of this pandemic, there's no serious plan made to address beds or staffing capacity or to ensure that the waiting lists for routine procedures don't reach the millions that we're now seeing. And the end result is that patients will wait longer for treatment, they'll face delays in treatment, services are continually being moved, renamed, disappearing, or offering less. Instead of protecting and rewarding NHS staff for their contribution in saving thousands of lives, this government has failed them on NHS safety, and they delayed their pay rise and have only offered them 3%, which is below inflation, which will ensure that pay deflation continues in the NHS and staff will continue to leave. So what's the GMB doing about all of this? Well, we were the first trade union in the country to adopt the demand for a 15% restorative pay rise for all staff across the bandings. And we have now launched a formal legal strike ballot across the country. Why are we running a strike ballot in the NHS? We're running a strike ballot because standing aside and doing nothing isn't working. Exclusive partnership working is failing staff and it's failing patients. And we know that hospital staff can strike safely. Life and limb cover is the rule on a strike day. Our strike ballot closes on the 15th of December, so we want absolutely everyone to vote because we know they won't take strike action lightly. The truth is staff are desperate now, and we've seen it reflected in the marches up and down the country over the past year. And we have to be clear as well that Tory policies themselves are making people more vulnerable to this new variant. The rise in food banks is causing malnutrition that makes people more susceptible to disease. The rise in the costs of rent are pushing people into overcrowded housing, again, which spread disease, all perfect conditions for COVID-19. So I'll just finish on the point that organising is very, very important now at this point, because if we don't do it properly, the NHS, as we know it, will not exist in 10 years' time. And in the trade unions, we need to make sure that there's not just a rep in every single hospital trust, but a rep in every ward, every unit, and every area, including the outsourced staff and the clinical staff. And we need advocates in the defence of the NHS working inside the hospitals. And we must ensure that those people we find are genuine spokespeople for the staff and for the service. And we must have effective coordination across the trade unions and across the community campaigns, including People's Assembly, Black Lives Matter, campaigns like this and others, because the brutal reality is that every time we lose a service, it will require a major battle to bring it back. So the real issue is defending and improving what we have. And when we say no cuts and privatisation, we must make sure it means absolutely that. Thank you and solidarity.
Thank you so much, Helen, and solidarity to yourself and your union. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to say, writes prolifically on the economy, on government policy, and on tax justice. We know that the government says it's protecting the economy with its COVID policy, but is that the right policy? And is it even true? Let's hear from Richard Murphy, who is Professor of Accounting at Sheffield University and a long-standing campaigner for tax justice. Thank you, Richard.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me this evening. I'm also delighted to note that I seem to be, I think, the 7th or is it 8th speaker and the first man. That's extremely unusual and very welcome to see. Look, you've asked me to put this in the context of COVID, of course, and I have taken a big interest in COVID as well, partly because I'm married to a retired GP who has herself taken a major interest in this issue ever since it began. But let's just look at the economic policy that the government is pursuing. The assumption that they have is that at some point, COVID apart, austerity apart, the 2008 financial crisis apart, we are going to go back to what they call normal. And what they call normal is the pre-2008 laissez-faire, unregulated economy where bankers ran riot and their friends made a great deal of money without much constraint being imposed upon them. The City of London ruled. That is simply not possible. They might wish to believe that's what they want to deliver. That is what they're trying to deliver. Their low tax strategy is already heading in that direction. But the reality is that by doing so, they are literally building an impossible situation for the economy itself to function. Now, let's leave aside the climate crisis, which is one of my other concerns at the moment, although we should remember it's also running in the background, and instead just talk about COVID. If we are to have COVID, I entirely agree with to manage COVID, I entirely agree with the logic of this campaign. We cannot contain or live with COVID, as some say. The object has to be to eliminate COVID. We have to actually remove it as the threat. There is no other way to manage the economy. Why? Well, quite simply because unless we actually tackle this problem, we will have recurring crises. Now, I'm not saying that we won't have a crisis from something else. I'm not saying that we might not have an entirely new alternative pandemic. All these things are real risks and we can't control them. But our attention has to be focused upon this one major issue: how do we get rid of it? And we know that COVID is causing continuing economic disruption. As a matter of fact, I will be very confident in saying that Omicron is going to create a major new economic crisis for the UK from January onwards. Why from January onwards? Actually, only because we're deferring recognizing it now. The crisis already exists. We are already seeing people not booking restaurants. We're seeing people not having Christmas parties, whatever Boris Johnson says, and thank God they aren't, because somebody's got to take the responsibility for stopping the spread, and it's not him. And we are seeing the knock-on effects already, and we're going to see that accelerate very rapidly. I follow Deepti on Twitter. I read her threads. I see what she has to say. I read some of that stuff before she actually spoke to us this evening. We are going to see a rapid spread of COVID. Where are we most going to see that spread? We're going to see it, according to the evidence that exists at present, through schools, through workplaces, through hospitals, because that's almost inevitable, I'm afraid to say, and through socializing in hospitality. So if we are going to constrain this, what do we need to do? Well, the answer is we have to take steps to actually, A, increase social distancing, B, reduce the number of times when people have to interact, and that does therefore mean encouraging people to work at home wherever it is possible. But C, because we know that isn't always possible, particularly in a school environment, particularly in a university environment, for example, where there are advantages from face-to-face contact, we need to take the steps to eliminate COVID from the environment. And we know there's a recent study from Cambridge, Addenbrooke's Hospital. If you haven't read it, it's worth having a look at. They've done a study which shows that hyperventilation can undoubtedly reduce the spread of COVID. It's a simple, straightforward measure. The costs are not phenomenally high. I am aware of the conflict about promoting, obviously, climate change mitigation and suggesting that we put hyperventilators into all rooms and everything else. But frankly, this is a conflict that we have to manage, and we'll have to give up something else. If we value health, if we value clean air, and we must value clean air, to me, it's as much a right as clean water. And none of us would frankly want to put up with clean water. Well, we do in rivers and the sea, but coming out of our taps, we don't want to, because we know the health risk of that. If we value clean air, we've got to invest in the right steps to mitigate it. Now, that means the government has to change some of its most stupid policies. For example, at the moment, it is giving massive tax relief to any business that wants to invest in anything, whatever its social contribution to society, when instead it should be withdrawing that relief, which is promoting wants for no particular purpose, which are destroying the environment. And instead it should be focusing its spending on how do we actually provide the mitigation measures that are necessary in schools, hospitals, and so on. This could have been done last summer. I saw all the arguments for this by then. I saw people saying, let's put all these measures in place in schools. I spoke to teachers who wanted this last summer. Let's be blunt. Friends who are teachers were saying, why? How are we going to manage ventilation? I mean, last summer it was open the window. It most certainly will not be opening the window tomorrow morning in Cambridgeshire, where I am. So we've got to do that. But let's be clear about what the consequence of this for the economy is. if we spent the relatively modest amounts of money on ventilation, we would basically keep children in school. We would be protecting their parents. We would be letting their parents work. We would be providing support, therefore, for the economy to continue to function. We would, therefore, be ensuring that supply chains remain in place. We would, therefore, be controlling inflation. We would, therefore, be keeping interest rates under control. We would, therefore, be providing the stability that is the basis that we need to be able to tackle the other crises we face, including, and I'm going to mention it, the environment and the Green New Deal, because I co-authored the Green New Deal. So all of those things are basically based upon some incredibly sensible measures to mitigate COVID. So the question is, can we afford to mitigate COVID? And the answer is an unambiguous yes. How do I know? Well, because over the last 18 months, the government has spent over £400 billion on the COVID crisis, much of it, as we know, wasted, much of it spent on cronyism, thrown away, literally uselessly. And all of that money has come from the Bank of England. There is this claim that we must have austerity to come. We must make cuts, and we're already seeing this message, and we've seen increases in national insurance on those with lowest pay. And don't believe it when you're told the increase is 1.25%. It wasn't, it's 2.5%, because employers will be resisting pay rises based upon that 1.25% extra national insurance they've got to pay. So the entire burden will fall onto ordinary people. And at the same time, we're seeing already Rishi Sunak floating income tax cuts, which will be worth exactly the same amount of money that he said it was essential that national insurance should be increased to collect. And he's doing that to provide a tax cut to those who don't pay national insurance, i.e. those who don't work for a living, but who live off investment income. Now, can we actually use quantitative easing instead to provide this money, which is what we did to pay for the COVID crisis to date? Yes, we can. How does quantitative easing work? It quite simply means that the government increases its overdraft with the Bank of England. Does that overdraft have to be repaid? No, not ever. Is there any element of that which actually is a threat to our society or to our grandchildren, or going to leave a burden on them, or is it going to leave us with hyperinflation in the likes that Zimbabwe has seen? No, nothing at all will. And that money is simply the money supply. Quite literally, that overdraft keeps money circulating in the economy, when actually in net terms, the amount of money being created by commercial banks is falling, because so many people have become wealthier during the COVID crisis that actually net savings have risen, and therefore borrowings have fallen, and therefore there isn't enough actual new money being lent by banks to meet up with our demand for cash. And the only way we get cash is by banks lending or government spending through deficits. So we actually need this spending again. I mean, there's a virtuous circle here. We not only need the spending, we need it to be spent on the likes of hyperventilation and other things to keep this economy going. Government policy is the exact opposite, in other words, of what we need now to deal with COVID. It's the exact opposite of what we need to build stability. It's the exact opposite of what we need to provide the foundations for dealing with climate change in due course. It is everything that we do not need. And none of their arguments about why we can't afford such basic things as keeping children safe at school make any sense at all. It's time to tell them zero COVID is the way to go. And I'm entirely with you on that.
Thank you very, very much, Richard Murphy. Our next speaker is Kat Hobbs from We Own It, which campaigns on public ownership. This follows on from what we've already heard about the privatisation of NHS functions, and also follows neatly on from Richard's contribution. Kat can speak to us about current government policy on public ownership and the diversion of NHS resources to private sector providers, how this is further undermining the public service foundations of the NHS. Kat, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be part of this event, and so many absolutely brilliant speakers. I've found it so informative already, even before the questions. So I'm from We Own It. We campaign for public ownership in general. We make the case for public services for people, not profit. And we work really closely with organisations like Keep Our NHS Public, Health Campaigns Together, Unite, 999 Call for the NHS, Public Matters, Just Treatment, and everyone who's campaigning for our NHS to be owned by us, to be fully public as it should be, as it was always intended to be. And I believe that the NHS is the best thing that this country has ever created. And I think it's a travesty what is happening. I was at the Keep Our NHS Public's COVID inquiry the other day, and I have with me the People's COVID Inquiry, their a copy of their report about misconduct in public office, which I highly recommend everyone should read it, because it's just absolutely outrageous what has been happening. I'm going to talk just a little bit about how again and again our government has been starving the NHS of funding while pouring that money into the private sector. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough, so I hope I won't be coughing at you too much. So in the last 10 years, as we've heard, our NHS has had its funding cut in real terms year on year. And so since 2010, we have lost 20,000 beds, we have lost more than 100 A&Es, and we're short of staff, 90,000 staff, doctors and nurses that we need. So the waiting list was already 4.6 million before this pandemic began. Our NHS went into COVID with one hand behind its back. And then at every turn, what the government's done is it's handed money to the private sector instead of to the NHS. This actually began with the PPE crisis. So we produced a report which you might find interesting, which is about the NHS supply chain. The NHS supply chain, which was responsible for procuring and delivering PPE during the crisis, had itself already been privatised. So it had already been outsourced to a chaotic mishmash of private contractors, 11 different procurement contracts, and 4 different levels of profit taking before the PPE equipment arrived at the hospital or care home. So that was a kind of untold story, really, about the pandemic. We tried to get some coverage for our report, but we didn't get the coverage we were hoping for. And I think that's a really important aspect of the whole story. People were dying because they didn't have access to equipment. And if the NHS supply chain had been run in-house, it would have been much more efficient and effective. The government then ignored the 44 public health laboratories and employed the private sector to set up a parallel system of testing sites. They set up Test and Trace and gave £37 billion to Serco and Citel and other companies for a system that the Public Accounts Committee says has utterly failed to make any measurable difference to the spread of the virus. They could have given this money to local public health teams who are actually qualified to do this work. And then, as you all know, contract after contract was handed out to mates of the government in an unbelievable display of cronyism, from Matt Hancock's pub landlord being given contracts to Owen Paterson MP being paid £100,000 a year by Randox, which won £480 billion in contracts. They've now, in acknowledging that waiting lists are a problem, set up a deal with the private sector to hand over 10 billion over 4 years. And at the same time, when the NHS Trust asked for 10 billion to get through the next 6 months, this vital 6 months that we're in right now, they were only given 5.6 billion, just over half of what they said they needed, which is an absolute disgrace. And I think it's worth mentioning in this context the quote by Chomsky that we often quote and people often quote, but I think it's important, which is, this is the standard technique of privatisation: defund, make sure things don't work, people get angry, and you hand it over to private capital. That is what they're doing. We can't forgive them for this. We can't forget about the 150,000 people who've died already, the people who are living with long COVID, people whose lives have been destroyed, who've lost family and friends, because this government chose to undermine our NHS at every turn, and it chose to turn to the private sector instead of giving our NHS and its staff the funding and resources and support that it needed. So please, if you're not already involved in campaigning, and I'm sure you probably all are, but please do get involved. We have to reinstate our NHS as a fully public service. Our polling shows that 3 out of 4 people in this country believe that coming out of the pandemic, which we are not, but you know, as a result of the pandemic, we should be looking to reinstate our NHS, not to open it up further, as the government is doing with the Health and Care Bill. We have to make public health a priority and fight for zero COVID. And I think also we have to push for the Labour Party to commit to reinstating our NHS as a fully public service, and to start to shift the conversation around that. Anything else is really unacceptable. So if you're not already signed up to a campaign, do join us at weownit.org.uk, join Keep Our NHS Public, join the other campaigns that are happening, and let's fight back. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Kat. I'm very pleased next to be able to introduce Green Councillor and Party Spokesperson on Education, Vix Lothian. To underline the breadth of our campaign, I think the Green Party will be the fourth or fifth different political party to be represented on our different platforms. So we are all very pleased to welcome Vix. And the issue of transmission in the schools and the lack of mitigations there remains a vital topic. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so brilliant to be here and listen to such intelligent and compassionate and logical speakers this evening. So thank you very much. I mean, just imagine that if we had a news incident where 800 hospitalisations were happening a day and 80,000 children were sick, some of whom have died. You'd expect to see wall-to-wall TV coverage and front pages of newspapers and preemptive, significant and direct action to protect kids from the dangers and risks. But instead, we've seen our school-aged children who have arguably suffered the most in the pandemic, not just in terms of health, but social, sporting, creative opportunities, schools being closed, experiences that they can never, ever get back. And in return for this, for young people staying home and protecting the NHS and saving lives, they've endured disruption, they've endured limitations that have carried on for nearly 2 years. And whilst our government keep pretending that COVID is over and that things are back to normal, COVID continues to spread in our schools. Now, I'm a parent of 3. I'm a town councillor on the Isle of Wight. I'm the Green Party spokesperson for education, but I'm also a secondary school teacher. And I have been for the last 20 years, and I'm still a secondary school teacher. And I've done my time in warm, steamy, windowed classrooms and caught colds and sore throats and sick bugs and flu. We know that kids spread germs and diseases. So when in March 2020, it made sense that as an emergency measure to stop rapid transmission of COVID-19, we had to protect the NHS and we had to close schools and to keep them only open for vulnerable and key worker children. But we had to limit transmission in schools because they are community hubs of transmission with hundreds and thousands of teachers and support staff and parents and kids meeting indoors each day. Now, in March 2020, we didn't know how this virus transmitted. We thought, or the government was telling us, it was through hands and doors and contact, not necessarily air. So we took this drastic measure to stop the NHS from being overwhelmed. But after that, when our schools fully reopened in September 2020, we never really saw the government build on this evidence that COVID is airborne and invest in the protections. When I went back into school in September 2020, I had hand sanitizer and blue paper towels. And as we head to Christmas in 2021, it's not really much better. Now, last week, over 200,000 kids were absent from school due to COVID. Statistics show that teachers and educators are much more likely to get a positive COVID test than the general population. And yet we're still not classed as frontline staff when it comes to access of vaccinations. Hospitalisations of 5 to 14-year-olds are much higher now than they were in January 2021. And this is incredibly alarming, as Deepti put brilliantly in her analysis at the start, that we've got winter pressures coming on the NHS and our children are where it is spreading with very few mitigations. We've got no masks in classrooms. We've got no CO2 monitors. We've got no ventilation units. We've got no vaccines for up to 50% of children have not chosen to take up that offer of a vaccination for 12 to 15-year-olds. There's no vaccines at all for primary school age kids, no social distancing if you know children, no support for isolation and no contact tracing in schools anymore. And if you walked in, all you would see still is that bottle of hand sanitizer and a paper towel. Why must we wait for a crisis in our schools for this government to take any action? It's not good enough. Now, throughout the pandemic, the Green Party have been calling this out. We've been flagging it up. We've been talking about transmission in schools and why schools are crucial in the fight against virus transmission. And when we went to a lockdown in October 2020, it was only the Green Party who called for action in schools to protect staff, students, parents, and the wider community. And you might not be aware of this because our TV and our print media have attacked teachers like myself and educators for wanting schools to be safe. When in January this year, the NHS was under pressure and the virus was out of control, it was teachers and parents in the community who stood up and shouted out and said that we need firm action to protect our children in schools. And I kept my own child out of school because of my faith and trust in this government is so low, when one day later, the government U-turned. And now the Green Party, the Westminster politicians, the councillors, the members, we know that taking significant action in our schools is essential to keep this virus levels down and towards zero. Not complete school closures, and I don't want that for my own kids, but real meaningful action in schools, in preschools, in the wider community. Now on Thursday, I'm really pleased to see, this Thursday, the Protect People's Protect Education campaign, which needs all our support. And it's a joint action with Unison, with the GMB, with the NASUWT Teaching Union. And they're asking for greater protections in schools. And they're really not that radical. They're asking for ventilation, for masks, for contact tracing, and support for isolation when needed. And to this, I would add offering vaccinations to 5 to 15-year-olds and stopping attendance fines during a global pandemic. Teachers, educators, children have died. And looking at UT's analysis, even more will lose their lives if we don't act. Now, we owe it to our community and our kids and the NHS to keep fighting for these mitigations in schools. Our NHS has protected us since 1948 when we've needed it most, and it's been there for us. And now we can be there for our health workers in return. As parents, as teachers and community leaders, we can stand together with the list of simple requests. No, simple demands for ventilation, for masking in classrooms, for social distancing, contact tracing, not just relying on vaccines and boosters. Because the government's continuing to do what it's always been doing best, which is government by sticking fingers in their ears. And we can only see that the virus levels are going to rise in schools and hospitalizations will rise, and then deaths are going to rise. And once we make our schools safe, that's not the end of the impact of COVID on our schools and education. This COVID crisis has flagged up a much wider education crisis that teachers have known about for years. And it's a total failure of our education to focus on these high stakes exams, on teaching to a test, on drilling with facts. What our children have actually missed out on is social contact. It's trips, it's visits, it's opportunities to be curious. You take a look at the Green Party wider education policy to find out more about what we stand for. But more immediately, in the coming months and the weeks and the days, we must make our schools safe. We must protect our schools. And we can do that through speaking up, through sharing what's needed, through joining campaigns like this and like the campaign on Thursday, and looking out for not just workers in schools, but workers in our health service. And the Green Party will continue to support this campaign and our Keep Our NHS Public, We Own It, and our union campaigns. And I'm so proud to stand with everybody here tonight on this. And it's really good to see that the movement keeps growing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vix, and thank you for reminding us of the action on Thursday as well. The issue of inequality is too little mentioned in relation to health outcomes in the pandemic. Disabled people, the elderly, and Black and Asian people have all suffered far higher death tolls than the general population. So it's very important we hear once again from Wayman Bennett from Stand Up to Racism. Wayman will be able to tell us about the claims from the Home Health Secretary that the much higher death toll of Black and Asian people is all due to faulty oximeters. He will be able to tell us about the real position and the health and inequalities that racism produces. Welcome, Wayman.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak on on this meeting about zero COVID and the impact of COVID on all of us. You know, I spent my last Christmas in an intensive care ward after contracting COVID and double pneumonia, and watching so many people die on the ward still leaves me with the horror of what COVID is. 156,000 deaths lost, and the disproportionate amount of people just lost, disappeared, like their lives didn't matter. And obviously the NHS saved my life. I'm proud of all the people that did extra shifts and did all the things which were necessary to save my life. But I'm still left with the horror of all the people that lost their lives and the people that looks like they're going to lose their lives because of the willful look of our government not to take COVID seriously. Now, as Nhs said before, that, you know, Sajid Javid has made the thing about the question of oximeters, but he's made two claims. He's made oximeters, and he's also said that people are not willing to take up the vaccine. In other words, both of those things blame the victim. They blame the question of the oximeters being the failure, or actually people are just dying because they're not doing the right thing. And I actually think that's actually not true. I think it's a denial of the responsibility of government to actually take the question of COVID seriously. It's an attempt to try and pull over our eyes kind of the question of socioeconomic disparities, of living in more concentrated areas, and the refusal of the government to actually say we're going to do anything about that, or even to acknowledge it, or even to put out a COVID plan when people are disproportionately affected. And really what it says is that your life doesn't matter. And I'm sure we are for unity, but actually what we're seeing is almost an attempt of extension of racism, where not only does your life not matter, it's your own fault why you die. Do you know what I mean? Actually, you know, watching people in different communities lose their life, I think we have to say that what the report says, what's been important has been the response, I think, of responsible elements of the NHS and the community. Look at the reports that they've produced. It's not true that actually they support what the government's position is. What they've done is they've put out reports that explain the disproportionate forces of death. Firstly, they look at doctors, why doctors died disproportionately. The report said there was a lack of PPE in terms of the people that were on the front line. That's why so many of the doctors died. Then there was a report into the question of, there was a report in the Marmot, there was a question in the Mark Review from UCL, into the Institute of Health Equality, which, what did it say? What did it produce in 2020? What it said was there was links between ill health, including COVID, with deprivation. And also it particularly said that those people that self-identified as Black, Bangladeshi, Pakistani were in particularly excess deaths could be attributed to deprived areas. In other words, there was a combination between poverty, racism, and the willingness of a lack of social planning to deal with this. And we know this. That's why they got rid of many of the slums after the Second World War, because they accepted there was a link between these things. And suddenly we have a policy that's removed the question of responsibility of government and related all things like social housing, health to individuals, and also fundamentally to profit making, putting profit before people, putting the question of privatisation before people's needs. And then on top of that, blaming individuals. Have you done the right thing? Are you following it? And now, to be honest, we've had a government that said, don't wear masks, that the epidemic is over. What was that message that they sent to people? Even though I think lots of people questioned it, even now, a majority of people accept the idea that something has to be done. Why is this so important that we have zero COVID? Because when you listen to the expertise coming out of this committee and you listen to the reports that they've produced, they're cogent, they're carefully explained, they're put forward by confident people. And we need this, because when you're confronted with a Peppa Pig government who makes speeches like that, the way that Boris Johnson makes that, the mess that he made of that speech is the same mess that he's making of COVID. Oh, I've lost my place. I've lost control of the facts. I've lost control of the narrative. But the problem for this is a real problem. At the end of that, we knew the man was a fool. The problem is, the end of that, we know that lives are going to be lost. We know that when we look at the figures, the facts and figures, the destruction of people's lives and families' lives, and at the heart of that, that's why we are saying that when you look at racism in terms of the COVID, is actually what we're trying to do is rip away the idea of the question of why we want to put people central to that. What they would like to do is have conflict between black and white people. The people that died in the Channel are there to blame. Everybody is to blame, except for the responsibility. I'll end up with this. I've been told that £59 billion has gone missing from track and trace. We can't find it. It's gone. It's disappeared. Could you imagine what that money could do for the NHS? Could you imagine what it could do for education? I do think I know where that money went. It disappeared into the friends of our government, which is involved in what I would call high-scale corruption and high-scale, not just incompetence, but the two things together, the two twins of evil that contribute attacks on the growth of COVID. That is incompetence and also corruption. And the more we expose it by putting people as central to it, the more we're different. If we ever stay quiet, then I think we do the danger of allowing the voices that have been silenced, the nurses, the health people that gave their lives to fight against COVID, the people that lost their lives, particularly the black and different communities that have done that, we make sure they don't have a voice. And that's the reason why we want zero COVID, but we also have to understand that part of what we're trying to do is a campaign to win the hearts and minds for people to understand that they can make sure that their lives are central to making change. The NHS was born not because the rich wanted to give it to us. It was born because people demanded it after the Second World War. And we have to demand the end and a real strategy for challenging COVID now. So thank you very much. And I want to give a big shout out to Sabi, who's unfortunately not well and should be speaking in my thing. And I add that other thing, black women disproportionately carrying the burden of children, also doing all this. No wonder that they're ill more than the proportion. And that's ignored as well on top of it. So big shout out to everybody here that's working hard to do that. We'll carry on to do that. Unity and solidarity are two weapons. Let's make sure we exercise them together.
Thank you very much, Wayman, and please do pass on our best wishes to Sabi. And thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you to our brilliant speakers, as Vic Lothian called everybody intelligent, compassionate, and logical speakers on this. So thank you very much, and thank you for everybody who's tuned in with us this evening. I hope you found the meeting as valuable and informative as I did. Good evening.